said, I'm Sarah Muncy. I'm the managing editor at the University of Cincinnati Press, and I'm joined here today by colleagues in the University Press world. I will introduce them briefly. We have Kristen Buckles, the editor-in-chief at the University of Arizona Press. In addition to overseeing the editorial program, she's the acquiring editor for Indigenous Studies, the US-Mexico Borderlands, and for the series, The Feminist Wire Books, Connecting Feminism, Feminisms, Race, and Social Justice. Kristen is currently serving on the University of Arizona Libraries Council for Diversity, Social Justice, and Equity. We have Amanda Krause, the editorial design and production manager at the University of Arizona Press. She began at the press in 2013 after previous roles in newspapers and magazines in the university press community, in addition to guiding all AU press titles through the manuscript editorial, typesetting, and production processes. She also manages the press's pool of freelance copy editors and proofreaders. And Kristen Elias Rowley, the editor-in-chief at the Ohio State University Press since 2015, where she acquires Latinx studies, gender and sexuality studies, and literary trade for their Mad Creek Books imprint. She is a Mellon University Press Diversity Fellowship mentor and currently serves on the Acquisitions Editorial Committee for the Association of University Presses. Previously, she was the Acquisitions Editor at the University of Nebraska Press and Potomac Books. And lastly, Liz Scarpelli, my colleague and director at the University of Cincinnati Press. Liz was appointed the founding director of UC Press in 2017. Previously, she served as the director of publisher services at Baker & Taylor, was the assistant press director and sales and marketing director for Rutgers University Press, the college sales manager for Cambridge University Press, and the district textbook sales manager for Prentice Hall. So thank you all for joining me on this panel. The purpose of this panel is to discuss experiences professionals at 3 different presses have encountered regarding the promotion of inclusive, justice-forward language in their publications. Particularly with library publishing, the projects we produce don't fit neatly into typical publishing boxes and are each nuanced in their framework and production process. We certainly do not want this panel to seem as if we are, to appear as a series of solutions or quick answers to recognizing and adjusting language in publications. We don't know the responsibilities of your publishing organization, nor the structure of how your operation works. Instead, we hope that this will provide you with some ideas and some kind of base or framework on which to develop practices to integrate promoting justice-forward publications in your own work culture and workflows. When it comes to justice-forward language, in many cases, it is not solely an issue of terminology or specific words, though that can certainly play a part, but a concern regarding general tone, how non-white groups or other minorities are discussed and in which context. Antiquated or offensive narrative or whitewashed views of historical events may not be immediately obvious nor easy to spot initially and can be found in regional, scholarly, or general interest books. Knowing how to recognize errors and create a game plan to edit and then promote this type of language in publications can seem daunting and difficult to make into concrete and tangible steps. We want this panel to show you what some of those actual steps can look like at a variety of different presses. So today you will hear from 3 different presses: the University of Arizona Press, the Ohio State University Press, and the University of Cincinnati Press, each of which varies in size and the subject matter that they focus on. This panel has quite a few attendees, which we are thrilled about, but we want to make sure that there is some engagement in a large virtual environment. So we'll be including some survey questions throughout, and then opportunities for Q&A between the individual presentations, and then more generally at the end. We've also created a working document that we hope attendees will use to track their feedback on best practices at their own institution or just experiences they have had. At the end of the panel, I will work on cleaning it up and organizing it so that we can send it out to conference attendees. I'm going to put in the chat, I will repost it a couple times, just so everyone who joins the panel can see it. If you're comfortable, please include the name of your institution so we can know where this information is coming from. So before we hear from our first press, I would like to begin with the first poll question that we have. Have you had an incident at your press where it came to your attention that an author used problematic language in their manuscript? And at the end of this panel, I will take some of the feedback we get from this and put it in the document that I will share with everyone. So give a minute for that. All right, so I would like to then move on to our first press and first presenters, Kristen Buckles and Amanda Krause from the University of Arizona Press.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah and Liz, for putting this panel together. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'll start by saying that the University of Arizona Press is situated on the traditional homelands of the Tonopah people who have lived here in the Sonoran Desert from time immemorial. The University of Arizona is in Tucson, which is about an hour's drive north of the US-Mexico border. It's about 60 miles. And in fact, Tucson was actually part of Mexico until 1854. At that point, the border moved to be south of Tucson with the Gadsden Purchase. And so I bring this important history up because I think to the founders of the University of Arizona Press back in 1959, who were mostly like white anthropologists and ethnohistorians, they were very deeply interested in the unique history of this place and the people who live here in Southern Arizona, the indigenous people, and the effects of these waves of colonization. First, the Spanish colonization, the Mexican, the US government, sort of the effects of these waves of colonization had on place. And so I bring this up because it's really important to our history and sort of recognizing like how we got on the editorial path that we're on now and we've been on for the 60 years we've been publishing books. Because we're a small press, we publish about 50 books a year. We have about 12 people on staff, and we have this very, I would say, a pretty narrow, pretty focused editorial program that really, the hub is like these 6 interrelated areas that include Indigenous studies, Latinx studies, and the US-Mexico borderlands. This is sort of the corridor list. And so because we've been publishing in this area for so many years, we have this sort of institutional understanding of the scholarship, the intellectual trajectory, and the people working in these areas. And this is important because the scholars working in these areas are a diverse group of scholars. Most of the folks that I work with in Latinx studies and Indigenous studies are Indigenous people and Latinx people. And so for me personally, like I unfortunately don't have to deal a lot with issues of problematic language because the very nature of the books that I work on the books themselves are doing the work to promote justice language. And so, so what I do grapple with is the fact that I'm a white person, I'm a white woman working with a lot of Indigenous scholars and Latinx scholars. And, like the Lee and Lowe survey tells us, like publishing is mostly a white industry. As I think many of us know, the 2019 survey results is like publishing is 76% white. And so what I do in my personal work to put forward, justice for language and publications is like, as a white person, like I feel very strongly that I want to put in the work to be a good ally to support the scholars working in these areas, because these books are so important to do that justice forward work. And so I guess I'll just bring to the table a couple of things that I do that are really important to me to really, work on these social justice books. Is that first, I as sort of the acquiring editor, I want to be a really good advocate to the authors. And so the authors are often, I think, because they're working in Indigenous studies, which by the nature of Indigenous studies, they're sort of a essential tenet to sort of decolonize the academy, decolonize literature, do this sort of decolonizing work that then sort of plays into our publishing program. And so what they're bringing in Indigenous studies and Latinx studies too is sort of bringing us sort of new forms of scholarship that maybe brush up against or push against sort of what we might consider the traditional form of a monograph. And so as sort of the acquiring editor, I listen and I hear about sort of the desire to sort of change what a monograph might look like. And so instead of like saying no, what I want to do is really like listen to this and let the authors lead, and let the authors really lead us in the direction of like where we should go in terms of justice publishing. And so that might mean like taking sort of requests that we might as publishers think are unusual, bringing them and really having a good conversation with my colleagues about why we might want to do this. And I have like one example comes to mind. We have a book that is called Coloniality of the US-Mexico Border. And the way the author spells that and uses the punctuation in there is coloniality of the U-S 3// Mexico border. And so the sort of the nature of using that unusual way of presenting that title, I think at first was like, what's this going to do to the metadata? This is not what Chicago, this is not how Chicago does it. Like there were just all of these internal questions about just sort of this unique presentation of US-Mexico border. The author had very good reasons for that. And so I bring this as an example of like how I advocated for the author and really sort of brought this to the press as a way of like, let's stop, let's listen, there's a reason for this. And we ultimately, of course, supported the author's decision of changing sort of how the normal conventions of what we might expect. Another thing I do is very carefully consider peer reviewers. That's really sort of baked into my process, especially because I am not a part of the communities in which we publish. I'm not Indigenous, I'm not Latinx. And so I think very, very carefully about our peer reviewers and wanting to make sure the perspectives of the authors are also sort of presented in the peer reviewers. And so I think with that, I will turn it over to Amanda to continue the conversation about the University of Arizona's Press's practices.
Yeah, so thank you, Kristen, for sort of talking about the acquiring process and how, as a publisher of Indigenous studies and Latinx studies, we are in a unique position where we're able to take the lead from our authors in how we use language in the books that we publish. So as the editorial design and production manager, a large part of my role is the manuscript editing part of the process. And one area where we run into issues is the Chicago Manual of Style is very much traditional and slow to adapt to the changing conventions of language. So one thing that I have to do in maintaining our house style guide is finding that balance of where to pull a little leeway from Chicago. And the book Kristen mentioned, The Coloniality of the US-Mexico Border, is a really good example in how it sort of changed my thinking in grammatical conventions in books. So that was one where we didn't change our official house style to always be U-S/ Mexico border, but it was one where I had to make sure the copy editor knew up front, like, this is a decision we've made. This is the part of the author's argument is founded on this sort of structure and how he's talking about the border, and working with the copy editor to take the author's lead on that. There's other places in our house style guide where we're able to sort of more formalize newer terms or flexibility in our preferences for how words are used. And a lot of that we do take from our authors. So publishing a lot, and you'll notice Kristen said Latinx studies. We were a pretty early adopter in making that officially part of our house style, because we have a lot of scholars in that area that that introduced the term to us before we started seeing it more often. And when Merriam-Webster, which updates their online dictionary a lot more frequently than Chicago puts up new editions, adopted that into the dictionary, I was like, okay, we can put this into our house style guide. And let's see, Kristen had mentioned different forms of scholarship. That's another area where we have to build into our house style guide of, these are our preferences, but you have to take the author's lead. So particularly with the introduction of the Feminist Wire book series, that pushed our publishing list into some areas that we didn't always publish in. So we had a couple of African-American studies, and then suddenly I had copy editors asking, should we capitalize Black or not capitalize Black? And that is one where, for that particular book, we followed the author's preference. And then as that became a more common question as we did more in gender and race studies, as part of that series, and also our Latinx studies will often, that list will intersect with gender and race. And so I did some research. I followed the Conscious Style Guide, which is like an online community that like aggregates articles about changes in language and ways to promote DEI in styles. And they had a whole bunch of interesting articles about whether to capitalize Black or not, and whether you should enforce parallelism with white. Ultimately, in our house style guide, I decided to follow what some other publications were doing, which was to recommend capitalize Black. I see in the chat there's someone asking about the house style guide. And I can send those links when I'm done talking. I'll have to search for it. But our house style guide is online in our author toolkit on the website. So that's easily available. So for that particular issue, we recommended capitalizing Black, because that seemed to be most of what scholars were doing in that area, even though that was like completely contradictory to the current edition of Chicago. And even though it's not parallel, we recommended keeping white lowercase, because that is capitalized white is often tied to white supremacist movements and white nationalism. And so for us, we thought, okay, let's we don't want to like put any associations there in our bridge. But then it turned out that there are scholars of African American studies and Black studies that actually recommend capitalizing both. Like Ibram X. Kendi is a big proponent of capitalizing both. So I had to go and update our style guide. I think it still needs updating to put a little asterisk there of, this is our preference, but if an author wants to do otherwise, then as long as it's consistent within the manuscript, that is something that we would allow. Likewise with Latinx studies, I'm actually seeing our authors now argue for Latina/O/X, because X was originally introduced to get out of the gender binary, but there are individuals who identify as specifically Latina or specifically Latino because their gender is a part of their identity. An X might imply that they were non-binary themselves, and so is less aesthetically on the page that many slashes in a row can be. It's more inclusive to cover all the bases and make sure that you're using the language to identify people in the way that they prefer to be identified. I think that's all I have for updating our house style guide. And I do, as questions will come up frequently, or if I hear new information from one of our authors or from resources like the Conscious Style Guide, I do update it as things come up.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Kristen. Those are excellent, excellent pieces of advice. I wanted to open up the floor for a few questions, if there are any, particularly since Kristen does have to leave the panel a little bit early. So now's your chance if you have any questions. Otherwise, we can certainly move on. Not seeing any in the Q&A. All right. Well, then I do have one quick question for you, Kristen. When you're talking to peer reviewers, do you give them like a framework to work on, like that we're trying to watch for this kind of language, or certain things you want them to pay attention to regarding inclusive language when you enlist them for the project?
I do not. I don't have specific questions in my appraisal form. But what I do is, like, if I have a, you know, for example, a non-Indigenous historian writing about, you know, the history that includes some part of Indigenous history, what I'll do is I'll really intentionally look for an Indigenous scholar who's part of the tribe that's being discussed in the book to look at the book. And the questions are, I think, written broadly enough, are appraisal questions where there is sort of the opportunity for the Indigenous person to weigh in and point out if there's any problems in the language. So really it's about finding the readers who have the perspective to be able to peer review work from, you know, from different perspectives.
Right. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. So I will then say, can we pull up the second poll question? We'll do 2 survey questions in between these panels or presentations. Wait for these. If your publishing organization has encountered language concerns, at what point in the process is it usually spotted? These are pretty broad sections of the publishing process, but we recognize that library publishing operations all look different. So we tried to capture it all in here. Right, and if we can go to the second poll, or third poll now. Does your publishing organization require authors to revise if such an issue is found? This requirement being, do you have the authority also to ask authors to revise if an issue is discovered? All right, so I will share the feedback from these surveys at the end of this panel when I can actually check and see what they are. But for now, we will move to our second press. We will hear from Kristen, Elias, Rowley from the Ohio State University Press.
Thank you, Sarah. And then I am going to drop into the link here our house style guide, just for reference to another one. It's also available online, but as I'm in acquisitions and not editorial, I'll leave that for you to look. But our general policy is to defer to authors, to scholars in their fields, to their own positionality, to consistency within the manuscript, as long as all of that fits within the larger scope of our mission toward justice forward language and inclusive language. So weighing those things carefully together. I wanted to talk a little bit about non-scholarly books and books that don't go through the two peer reader process, the projects that have really different from each other kinds of processes that make it incredibly difficult to, or just make it be a lot of different ways that we have to suss out these kinds of problematic languages or issues that we might have to deal with. So we publish about 50 to 60 books a year, and a third of those are not scholarly monographs. Those are regional trade, memoir or history, literary trade, fiction, nonfiction, graphic novels, and then university projects, things that we pick up that might be department histories or university histories. And the vast majority of those don't go to two readers. So thinking through the other stakeholders that we have that can help acquisitions editors and authors identify language and issues that need to be dealt with. So one thing that comes to mind is we do have an alternative board that we created for our regional imprint, for our Trillium imprint. And that is a board that we created of booksellers, local historians, other folks with vested interest in Ohio regional work. And really, this board has been helpful in identifying things. We send some of those projects to readers, particularly those that are historical in nature, but they really go to readers that are looking at fact checking, not necessarily looking at tone or writing in any kind of way. So the board in these cases see the full manuscript, and they are helpful in identifying those kinds of language things. I mean, again, this is outside of all the work that an acquisition editor should be doing, of course, as well, to identify that language. Another stakeholder that can be really useful in these conversations and in identifying these issues are series editors. So for myself, Mad Creek Books is our literary trade imprint, and those books don't go out to readers or to a board unless I choose to take them to readers. That's just our faculty editorial board approved our trade imprint and gave me the power to run that as I saw fit, which is great, but that's a lot of responsibility then on me without that backup system to help with those things. So choosing series editors with different areas of expertise from my own and that align in their mission with our mission as a press to promote justice inclusive language, but projects that are justice inclusive in and of themselves is really helpful in a balance to just my own set of reading on it. If they aren't versed in that inclusive language, they can be a roadblock to first finding projects that are not necessarily projects that we want to be promoting, or not understanding the complications and why we don't want to be behind a certain project or publish it. We do see this even on the scholarly list, though. You know, Kristen talked about the way they have synergy across their list. There's, I would say our scholarly list is fairly wide ranging at Ohio State University Press. It is a marriage between the lists we've been publishing in for some time and the newer lists we have grown in race and ethnic studies, gender and sexuality studies, rhetoric, and contemporary literatures. We do have lists like medieval studies and classic studies that have been more traditional in the past that have had some excellent books on them, but that also maybe have series editors that have been involved with those series for quite some time, maybe aren't keyed into some of these conversations or don't see how their disciplines are affected by that. And it has necessitated conversations about adding or diversifying our editorial board for that series. So if it's not finding new series editors, are the series editors willing to work with a series editorial board? And then also prioritizing diversifying the publications within that series, because that really shows our priority as a press to the whole field, to those readers, that justice forward content and language is an expectation and a norm across our publications, so that it isn't something that is just screening manuscripts for that later on, but putting out there that this is expectations of that series as a whole. Certainly my colleagues have been an excellent source as well in identifying things in projects, especially I would say other members of acquisition, marketing, and our editorial team, because they're involved with the projects earlier on in the process. Now, ideally, these are things that we are dealing with foundationally or before it goes into production. But as we all know, that's not always the case. So, recently we had a project that deals with the history of hate groups in Ohio, and it includes numerous repeated racial, ethnic, and homophobic slurs because they are direct quotations of material. The acquisitions editor didn't address this with the authors because it made sense in that context. They agreed to that style, but the editorial team brought this up, wondering if we should replace letters with asterisks or em dashes because they were used so frequently and because they were worried about triggering or enacting further trauma on historically traumatized communities and readers. So this hadn't occurred to the acquisitions editor through no fault. Again, this book is about exposing hatred in the state, and it is a justice forward project in and of itself, but these groups came at it from a different perspective of what should be included. We discussed it as a team, myself included, and brought it up with the authors and chose to add a note that on the graphic content of the book that addresses both the slurs and some of the images as well. We all were in agreement about that. We think that's a great addition to the book and a way to marry the historical accuracy of that with the fact that this can be further traumatizing for communities. What's interesting to note about this, though, is also that the historian who wrote the books forward actually wrote to us upset that we had asked the authors whether or not those words should be included in that context. They misunderstood our inclusivity concerns as actually an attempt to sort of soften the horrific legacy and language of hate groups in the state. And they were adamant that it needed to be included for those reasons. So I mentioned that because it really demonstrated how nuanced all these conversations are on a project by project basis. And that even though all of us from all of these perspectives were coming at this as a justice forward-looking project, we all had a different understanding of what that would look like or how it could affect readers. And so I think it's a singularly excellent example of that. We also have had projects with our university, with our board of trustees where they have hired the writer, they've vetted the project, it comes to us sort of ready to go. That said, we're still the publisher and we want to make sure that everything's in alignment with our mission. And in reading it, my assistant editor actually identified some really problematic anti-inclusive language and ableist undertones in certain anecdotes. And this for me is another great example of something that seems like it's outside the purview of promoting justice or inclusivity language, but really is key to it too, is that hiring, how and who we hire really affects our ability to provide an expansive understanding of this inclusive language and to enact that in all aspects of what we do. Because there were some of these instances that I had missed as a reader, and I feel very attuned to this as part of my job and what I do every day. But my assistant editor has different expertise, different experience. People are keyed into have different paradigms, different awareness. And it's really integral that when we look at who we hire, that we're looking at how do we expand our knowledge as a press, not how do we hire to fit, to be a fit for us or whatever that means. I've heard that said in some ways. Just a very big proponent of looking at when we have the opportunity to bring new staff, whether that's students up through managers, how does that benefit our organization, our authors, our readers, et cetera, in these decisions that we're making at that level. We also have the opportunity, even though I don't send my trade manuscripts out for review, there are times that I choose to do so because I think I cannot provide a sufficient enough analysis of this, or there's so much here. It's such a large part of this project. This is really going to benefit from another reader. Sometimes they're referred to as sensitivity readers. In any way that you choose to look at it, that can be the case. And I've had authors that have even given me a heads up, one writing about race relations between Jewish and Black communities in the South. As a Jewish Northerner, she knew she did not have, she knew she had a bias that was implicit and that she needed help with the book. And that was something we identified really early on, to send it to a writer working in the same genre, writing about Black Southern life and memoir and cultural history that could do that. Other writers are not aware of that bias, and that is a complicated conversation to have. I had one author writing in very nuanced ways about race and socioeconomic issues, who needed to significantly reconsider how he handled issues of gender and sexuality. And that conversation was difficult because the author really did not recognize that they had an implicit bias there. And working through how to address that when they don't recognize that there's an issue was its own complicated beast. Even though that stuff is usually identified, hopefully earlier in the process, I do think an important part is centralizing justice-forward language overall and inclusivity at the press as a whole. We are a fairly small press, like Kristen and Amanda at ASU. I think we're also 12 full-time staff members. But talking with all of our employees, even those that aren't actively involved in evaluating manuscripts for that kind of language, I think really helps center that as a priority for everyone and also empowers them to bring up those concerns when they do see them, because stuff does slip through. We do miss things. So whether that's marketing or whether that's someone in production who's involved with the design and not with this kind of language thing, it's helpful. And one way that we are doing that as a press is through optional staff readings, a sort of book club of sorts, but we've purposefully chosen books that are not necessarily scholarly in nature. And so the most recent one, or the ones that we're recommending next, is You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey. It's written by a comedian, Amber Ruffin. And it's essentially, I think someone described it as hilariously horrifying, but it's experiences with everyday racism. But all of this really, I think, helps key in all of our key players to the different ways that we see the world and how it's not the same as how other people see the world, and really opening our eyes to all of those different ways we should be paying attention to that in manuscripts. So yeah, I guess that's what I have as far as different stakeholders and how they can play a part.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly useful. And I would like to remind attendees that, and I will put the link in the chat again correctly this time, to add your own experiences, because I think what we've learned from these three panelists, again, is that projects are so nuanced and individual, and we all come to them with different awarenesses and unfortunately implicit biases on our own part. And so seeing the different projects and different practices across the publishing industry would be really helpful. And before we jump into the third presentation, I would like to do the last poll, the fourth poll. Has your publishing organization discussed how to handle language issues and encourage justice-forward publications? Has there been a conversation? Has someone started a dialogue on this to have this worked into your workflow or work culture in some way? Right. And with that, we'll start our presentation from the third press, my own press, the University of Cincinnati Press. We are going to be discussing a case study of the book that essentially gave us the idea to spearhead this panel, because we had a book that came to our attention that had problematic language, and we realized we didn't quite know what to do in terms of handling that specific case, and what to do in the future and what practices to implement for all of our books to ensure that inclusive language was used. In this case, we had a book that reached the proofreading stage when the proofreader then brought to our attention that they were very uncomfortable with some of the language that was used in regards to Indigenous tribes in the Ohio area. This was a regional title for general readership. Each chapter of the book walked readers through a bicycle tour of the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area. And then with each tour, they would detail the history behind the landscape and the various stops along the way. So certainly not a title that it made us pause at the beginning, that we thought could have some problems. It went through the peer review process, and one of the authors was an academic historian. So you know, it kind of checked a lot of boxes and didn't necessarily trigger anything else for us to look into until it was brought to our attention. This particular proofreader had a background in sociology as well as Native American studies. And recognizing my own blind spots in this area, I brought it to two Native American studies scholars or contacts that I had in the academic community to gauge their reaction and to see what kind of game plan we could work on in terms of adjusting the language, because part of it was also identifying what actually needed to be changed, what actually was problematic. And so more specifically, I think it's helpful to talk about these things, talk about them specifically, not in the abstract. In this case, there was a distinct separation of Indigenous American history as being separate, verbiage that indicated that white or settler history was the main narrative and anything else was something in addition to that, that it was not mainstream American history. There was very little mention that settlers were in fact invading Indigenous land. So there was a lot of references to Indigenous retaliation and violence, particularly the Shawnee tribe. So much so that there was no mention of the Shawnee people outside of solely violent narratives, even though their connection and history to the land certainly predated the settlers. We felt that some elements were missing, particularly more inclusion of the actual tribe names when the authors didn't know or hadn't perhaps done the right research. They just reverted to Native American tribes quite broadly when you really could find out what were the specific tribes. They were the Shawnee and the Adena tribes in Ohio. And there was also a lack of context into some of the stories they told. They recounted some stories that are really popular in just Ohio, Kentucky discourse that are stories of their own, but were then exploited and reused by people at the time to paint Indigenous people as savage or violent, and without this context, it sounded like the authors were agreeing or promoting these stories to a level that they weren't quite due. And lastly, we were uncomfortable with the flippancy towards Indigenous heritage as if it did not exist outside of military might. After some careful reading, we were a bit, I suppose shocked is somewhat of the right word, when they wrote at one point that at the time Native power was real and that the removal process from the land was inevitable. So this kind of bias that was really present in the book that wasn't easy to take out. And so it took quite a bit of time and a lot of work on my own part and Liz and many of our student assistants to trim out some of the problematic paragraphs, to try and balance the narratives as we talk about these quote unquote heroes in American history, and to add some contextualization and verbiage to the book itself, essentially writing pieces in. And so then after we did this, we returned it to the authors to see the edits, and they were not receptive to them quite at all and did not understand why they needed to be had. They thought that they were preachy. And so we will turn the discussion to Liz, who had the task of talking to the authors about why these changes were necessary and kind of the relationship she had to build, and what we kind of plan to try and implement in the future. So we don't have a situation like this where we are dealing with it so late in the process. Proofreading is quite a ways there, and we would not like to do that again. So I will then turn it to Liz. Liz, you're muted.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to say thank you to the other panelists. I've been busy scribbling down ideas and things that I've heard from the other panelists, and I just think that's wonderful. This is really about sharing some experiences and ideas. None of us have the right answers at the moment, but I think we've got some good threads here. So a little bit of context about the project that Sarah's talking about and about our own press. We are a press of 3 full-time people and 6, right now we have 5 student workers. which puts us at a slight disadvantage because we don't have the opportunity to have as many eyes on the project and have these discussions in advance all of the time. We'd like to think we do, but in practical matters, we truly don't. The exchange of that is that Sarah and I work very closely together, and it's very easy for us to get each other's attention and say, hey, we need to discuss this. So I had acquired this book a couple of years ago. The book was written by two local people, one, as Sarah said, a historian from another university, and one was both avid cyclers, and the other was in another profession. He actually was an architect. But the book had gone through a long process, not necessarily with us per se, but they had approached another publisher that had different ideas than what they had wanted. And so after a period of time, a long time, well over a year, they just decided to cut that other publisher loose and look for someone else. And that's how they came to the University of Cincinnati Press. Then we had planned to publish it in the spring of last year. And well, or the summer, I should say. And we decided that with all of the flux going on with COVID and distribution systems and stores not being open, that a book like this, even though it was perfect for a COVID environment, we were uncertain of how to actually market it and worried about some of the inventory that stores would have. And so we decided to delay it in and make it a lot more interactive and parts of it open access. So, you know, I had already had a conversation with them and they agreed wholeheartedly that we should delay it until 2021. But coming back to them at the point in time where we were up to proofreading and we thought that we were going to be smooth sailing into a March pub date, the last thing in the world they wanted to hear was that we had to delay publication to address this issue. So, you know, the conversation was not met very, very warmly. They were not as thrilled with some of the concerns that we had. And as some of our other panelists said, really didn't recognize what some of the issues were. And that, that was where part of the conversation started. We are, as all publishers want to have forward justice language and want to do right by all of the communities that are out there. But our list is built on social justice issues. So we take it very seriously when we have some kind of an issue that in one way or another might misrepresent or whitewash a particular story or description of something. The other thing that makes this book and some of the books that we deal with in our press challenging is that they are open access. And so when you're publishing an open access book or a book that has open access resources with it, you don't always know who's going to be reading your book. It's not as though you can say, well, this book is for a very specific audience. This particular book was a regional book. Cyclers come from all different walks of life. They are all different colors, shapes, sizes, and everything else. And so you can't have a composite expectation of who the readers are going to be in this particular book. And that was something that became very apparent to us in this process that, well, you know, who's really going to pay attention to these, you know, few passages here and there that talk about, you know, the early days of Ohio and the European community moving to Ohio. But in fact, this is important. And this is something that we didn't want to be not only called out on, but we wanted to take a stand in making sure that we were doing right by all communities in Ohio. And so I did have a conversation with them. We did initially flag, and Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but we did initially have some conversations with them about where the copy editor and the proofreader, I should say the proofreader, identified some suggestions that the proofreader had, which they were quite resistant to. And so we then took the time, and Sarah did much of it. I did a little bit of it, and rewrote those passages again so that they were as equitable as we could possibly make them. And it took a little bit, it took a lot of hand-holding with the authors just to get them to be comfortable with the fact that we were going to be changing some of the language. But, you know, again, it was part of, we can't determine who is going to be reading this book. And beyond that, we want the book to be accurate from the standpoint of equality, accurate from the standpoint of all groups. And so eventually they did decide that we had done a good job in doing some of the rewrites. And so we were able to move forward with the book, but we had pulled it from production. And I think that's one thing that as a director, I'm very grateful for, because I do have the ability to determine whether a book moves forward or not. Whereas when I was the marketing director at Rutgers, I was one of several voices. When I was a sales director at Cambridge, I was one of even more voices. But here, with it just being the two of us, we do have a third person, but he works on other pieces of our program, mostly journals. With Sarah and I, we do have the opportunity to make that decision thoughtfully. And I am not afraid to say, I'm sorry, we can't move forward with this book and until we get a resolution that we're comfortable with. So I'm going to stop here because I see we have questions piling up and I want to give time for people to answer them.